Hello and welcome to this RedMonk conversation. My name is Kate Holterhoff, Senior Analyst at RedMonk, and today I am joined by Andrew Tunall, President and Chief Product Officer at Embrace. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kate.
Yeah, this is going to be exciting. So Andrew, let's set the table. Give me the elevator pitch for Embrace. What problem do you solve?
Yeah. So, this won't be the 10-second elevator pitch because we're not, we don't sell vacuums at Embrace, but to set up kind of the, our larger hypothesis, the larger observability, I'll say SaaS-based observability world and monitoring world has now been around for over 20 years. I think Dynatrace was founded in 2005. New Relic, where I was before I joined Embrace, was founded in 2008. So these are not new companies. It's not new concepts. But by and large, right, the center of gravity for those products has historically been the kind of maturation of infrastructure and increasingly application observability on the data center side. And, that's reflected not only in the tooling that they have for operators, for, Kubernetes clusters and everything else, but if you look at even CNCF projects, the maturity of service meshes and, the Kubernetes project, even OpenTelemetry and kind of where it's centered around app and infrastructure observability is really a reflection of the kind of progress that those teams have made in just becoming more mature in how they operate modern digital applications. And that same maturity has broadly not come for front-end developers. I think if you look at like the biggest conferences for even web devs, they're all, Vercel's Next.js conference, which I think is actually in like SF today. And, even in mobile, you see a lot of conferences around Swift UI or Jetpack Compose and Android, et cetera. And you very rarely see even meetups where front-end developers are talking about the implications of really measuring whether the app is performing the way they expect it to perform for their users to be successful. And that's what we're all about, is we have discovered that the most forward-thinking digital companies in the world are increasingly not just caring about whether or not the service that talks to the mobile app or website is performing well, but whether the digital user experience, that actual user interacting with the app, is having a good time. Because, we've put out research before. You and I have talked pretty extensively about the negative implications of user perceived bad performance in terms of user retention, in terms of their ability to stay engaged with your experience. But broadly speaking, like the world just has not evolved to have that level of maturity in measuring and improving. So that's what we do.
I like it. And anytime we talk about front-end engineering, it's near and dear to my heart. So recently, you published a report entitled Defining and Measuring Mobile SLOs. So I am familiar with service level objectives as a general concept in the observability space. However, mobile SLOs seem to be doing something slightly different. So what is a mobile SLO and why do organizations need to worry about them?
Yeah. We talk about mobile SLOs because obviously we're an observability platform for mobile engineering teams and the operations teams that support them. But broadly speaking, front-end SLOs or mobile SLOs are really more about the actual experience a user is having when performing a particular activity, as opposed to the individual service components that support it. And so like a great example of that is if you think about you using an e-commerce app where you're searching for some sort of item in a product catalog. You as a user don't really care about the individual services or render activities inside the app supporting that. You just care that when you type in, lawnmower into the e-commerce app and hit the little magnifying glass or enter on your keyboard, that all of the individual components work to return search results and render them and make the result set interactable on the device. And so a mobile SLO is indicative of user-facing behavior that matters to you as a business, because people can't add items to their cart if they can't effectively.
And if having these types of SLOs is so important, why isn't everyone doing it? Or is everyone doing it and nobody just talks about it?
Yeah, and going back to kind of the history, I guess, the setting up the conversation. The reason they don't measure it is because they largely don't have the data. And that's in part because the tooling ecosystem has been set up to be broadly just reactive. Yeah, it feels silly to say like measuring is important, but if you actually have standards for what you think are the interaction times or the behaviors that users are tolerant of in order to complete the activity you want them to when you're designing a user experience, if you can't measure it, you have no idea whether or not it's actually violating your user standards. And most tooling that's existed in the market for the history of mobile has been very focused around error tracking, has been very focused around crash reporting, has been very focused around kind of, just for lack of a better term, vanity metrics in terms of like usage or error rates. And very rarely has it been focused around, what is the threshold at which we think when the app takes too long to be interactable, not just start and boot, but interactable, customers will lose interest and just force close it before they ever engage with the content in the app. And if I think because customers have lacked that data, because there hasn't been a lot of attention in the engineering organizations around obtaining that data, naturally people will kind of just measure the things that they have. And so, and especially the fact that most of the SLO movement has, happened with SRE teams and DevOps teams that have primarily been focused with backend services. I think it's just, the industry broadly hasn't reached that maturity yet.
So, as with most things, it sounds like a data problem.
Yeah, like obtaining the data can be tricky. You have to, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. Like, there's obviously some dimensions of what a mobile experience is like that are vastly different than what you would measure in backend services. But even more than that, unlike a lot of the domains that we've dealt with in the monitoring and observability world, this is installed software. So like an SDK that measures data is installed software that gets tightly hitched to installed software on a distributed compute ecosystem. Like mobile is not a distributed computing or a distributed system. It's a distributed computing ecosystem. You have monoliths running on millions of unique devices, not distributed systems running on a small number of devices. And the result is that, depending upon how you set up your project or anything else, just obtaining the data can be difficult. And without that kind of, I'll say more organizational desire to obtain the data, like when facing barriers, I think most people give up and are saying, we'll use whatever service metrics we have as a proxy.
All right, so let's plumb this issue of complexity here, which I think a lot of what you're saying is pointing at. What is it that DevOps teams who traditionally are working on these SLOs don't necessarily understand about mobile data?
Yeah, I think if you really thought about it in detail, like most of these would be pretty intuitive, but given the fact most people don't sit there and spend hours kind of poring over all of the components, the things that could exist, they maybe don't think of them as readily as I guess I do, because I spend all day thinking about this stuff. But you think about like variability of devices. So maybe less impactful in the iOS ecosystem because Apple has a relatively small number of devices, a relatively small number of chipsets. So their firmware updates and their OS updates are pretty consistent. But if you think about the Android ecosystem, it's a little bit of the Wild West. You have devices that are quite modern and fast, and you have devices that are quite slow and old, all running various versions of the OS. And, the obvious impacts of that when you're asking them to do things like rendering activities mean that you're going to get a lot of variability in what happens to users. Internet connectivity, right? You have people on LTE in places like the US. You have people on 3G connections in Central Africa, and depending upon your app and their internet connectivity, you get wildly different behavior. We also deal a lot with delayed data, which most observability ecosystems are generally poor at dealing with. And that's because, you have people in the subway and they lose connectivity and then they terminate their app, which is usually when marshaling would happen. You have people using trails to go hiking where they don't have internet connectivity. The app crashes. You still want to get that because if it's always crashing when you have no internet connectivity, you're just missing data. As with all front end third-party services, whether it's payment gateways or auth, ad SDKs, etc., are super common in mobile. And then you have like all of the user behaviors, some of which are elements of kind of I'll just say that the ecosystem, their properties. Like, does a user change app state? Do they force close during particular activities, therefore ending a span, for lack of a better, and it is a span, something you're measuring, where you might get data that tells you that something is always not lasting very long, but really it's because it's lasting so long that all users are terminating the app, therefore ending the data. And then you have human behavior that just drives app state, which is, mobile apps are stateful systems where, as I build up the things I am doing within the app, as I make choices, I'm actually holding context locally that ends up impacting a whole bunch of other things. And most of these just like are not well dealt with classic observability ecosystems. They're separate signals that are uncorrelated around human behavior.
Yeah, you're reminding me of conversations that I've had with folks who are grappling with the legacy of single page applications or SPAs, where they're dragging down all this JavaScript. And for folks with older devices, it's untenable. So yeah, you're speaking my language here. So here at RedMonk, we do think a lot about the developer experience. I think about front end engineers maybe a little bit too much, but in general, it's interesting to me that, with this user aspect, it is really crucial to be thinking about these mobile SLOs. So user-centeredness seems to be integral to the functioning of mobile SLOs, if I'm hearing the story correctly. Can we talk about that? Would you expand on that idea?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what I was talking about with the search functionality, if you kind of break that into its component parts, if you were to measure just, let's say, you take a step back. Classically, without any data captured on the client, you might measure your search services response time. And you might set a budget for what number of requests can exceed a certain response time threshold, because you intuit that a long response time will result in a degraded customer experience. And, like we could come up with some numbers here, but like, let's say that you set that at 1,000 milliseconds a second. You say if more than 5% or 10% of our users cross, or 10% of our requests cross a 1 second threshold, then we're in violation of the SLO. We've gone yellow. And your P50 response time, let's call it 250 milliseconds. Let's say your mobile app then has an SDK that handles all the requests to whatever service this is, auth SDK or a search SDK. And the SDK designer, being totally rational, looks at the distribution of requests and says, well, these always respond in 250 milliseconds. But if it takes twice that long, 500 milliseconds, we're going to go ahead and retry. And so you have then a degradation of the latency on the service that doesn't yet trigger your backend SLO, but pushes that P50 closer to 400 or 500 milliseconds. And suddenly you have a massive increase in requests because you have a retry storm coming from the device. Or you're not actually violating your SLO because everything's taking 500 milliseconds. You haven't crossed that threshold, but it's resulting in massive numbers of retries that eventually succeed on the user device. But users now perceive that activity, the login activity or search activity, is taking 5 times as long because it takes 5 retries before it succeeds within 500 milliseconds, which is the retry threshold you've set in the SDK. Today, people on the back end using an SLO of response time would have no idea that the retry storm or the increase in requests they are seeing is a result of a degradation in latency, because they have no information coming about the activity that is driving that. And maybe it's intuitable, but you definitely don't have common language to use with those app developers. And so when we talk about user-centered SLO, we say, like, stop talking about the technical componentry. That is important. You have to be able to break it down once something violates a threshold. But instead, like, if your contract isn't with the internet, but is instead with Kate, how do I measure Kate's activity and at what point she is no longer tolerant of the behavior? And how do I measure all of the contingent parts till I have ended that activity? And when it's critical, say if it crosses a certain latency threshold or error threshold, I know Kate's going to be upset. Now I actually proactively inform the team that we're kind of out of our budget of upset Kates. And so I can start addressing those. And ideally, you're giving those engineers common telemetry signals to have the conversation with backend engineers so that they're speaking the same language. Because if what I say is, auth is taking too long, and the backend team says, looks fine to me. Like, what are your latency metrics? And I'm like, I don't know latency metrics. I have 0 errors and I have user complaints. Both of them end up saying, not my fault. And then it's your users who end up suffering because you're kind of in like a, inability to resolve loop.
I love this metric of upset Kates. I feel like I need to start using that in my own life more often.
Just like
just throw it out there. All right. So let's think a little bit about, I guess, maybe the future of this, because I talk to a lot of folks about the future of SLOs. I mean, there seems to be a lot of excitement in this space. I'm really excited about where these things are going. And just like to name a few areas where I feel like SLOs are going to be really making an impact in the future. I mean, of course, can't have any conversation today without starting with AI. So, I mean, we're looking at these predictive SLOs. So instead of being reactive, we're trying to head off potential failures through these proactive measures. Machine learning is a big part of this advancement. But then we've also got dynamic SLOs, which I think are really picking up steam. And by that, I mean, they adapt to real-time shifts in traffic. And so, user behavior, these environmental factors, all of these are coming into play with, this sort of new way of approaching SLOs, which it sounds like you're sort of positioned to meet here. And, these are going to be especially useful to ensure that services perform optimally during busy periods. So, we always look at like a Black Friday as being one of those. But when on quieter times, resources can then adjust in turn. So all of these are seem to be part of the future here. And then of course sustainability, and this I think really ties with AI when we're thinking about starting power plants back up because AI is just is so resource intensive. So the performance metrics they're tracking not only velocity but also reliability and the energy that these workloads are performing. So, sustainability is also factoring into SLOs in these new and exciting ways. So, when we think about the goal of green computing, how are SLOs playing a role in that? It sounds like in the future that's going to be more and more apparent. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the future of SLOs? How are what are some more, I guess, practical use cases that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big shift is simply that customers, the people we talk to who are most interested in this right now are people who have spent a lot of time defining their error budgets and their SLAs and transforming them into SLOs in their data centers. And the question has shifted from during an outage, what percentage of our requests took X percentage of time to how many users were impacted. And a couple of years ago when I started at Embrace, I was talking to a director at one of our largest customers, and he said, I see your product as the future of how you operate a modern mobile user experience. And it took me a little while to fully grok what he meant. But I think increasingly what we're seeing people mean is I don't want to tell the story just through the lens of the data that we've been capturing for 15 years. We've made it, most people have unlimited data plans now. We've made strides in terms of the network connectivity infrastructure we can have to transit data out of an app. They have more, you're asking an app to do more, and they have more compute power. So it's relatively simple for us to capture meaningful data about your experience. They want to actually know, are our users having a good time or not? How can we design a system including the user-facing property that works to their expectations. And SLOs are simply a tool, right? Like it's just, I think the tool then becomes like, how do I create, and this is true like in any organization, but how do you create the like accountability tools for the organizational culture to deliver the outcomes you want? And, if you view SLOs as kind of like how the team measures, are they building software the way that your organization values? Then they're starting to think through, how do we not just test it locally in the emulator, verify that the boxes work, but how do we verify that when it's in our actual customers' hands, it continues to deliver the experience that we expect? Because that correlates to business results. Obviously, like I'm really interested in some of the things you were talking about, because as we think about like predictive SLOs, even as you look at that example I gave about like, an auth service or a search service that starts to degrade in latency, if you can start to correlate user behavior with some series of things that happen, you can start telling teams that creep on latency or error rates or whatever it is eventually going to result in kind of nonlinear effects when it reaches clients. And, if you can have teams that instead of just having a binary measure where they arbitrarily set it and say, okay, if, 10% of our requests are over a second, wake us up in the middle of the night, otherwise deal with it. And instead say like people's experience is actually getting worse. And we predict that this will eventually result in more churn, revenue reduction, bad reviews, et cetera. This is something you should prioritize as part of your everyday teamwork instead of responding to in the middle of the night. I think that builds better software and better experiences that for like virtually everybody, because I think like everybody's doing the internet on their phone. I mean, it was like 75% of digital transactions last year happened on a mobile device.
Wow.
So I mean, like I'm really interested in how this new set of data starts getting correlated with what mature teams have already done to just build stuff better.
Yeah, definitely an exciting time to be following SLOs and to be sort of, thinking through the future of that space. So we're about out of time. How can folks hear more from you, Andrew?
Yeah, the best way to if you care about what I'm talking about in my like business life is probably LinkedIn, both my LinkedIn profile as well as our Embrace LinkedIn profile. We'll share kind of like my Twitter handle and everything. I'll say, I'm not sure how long I have left on that platform. Day by day, just take it day by day. But that's more a personal opinion. So yeah, if you want to hear more about what we're doing, the Embrace LinkedIn account as well as my LinkedIn account are great places to follow.
Perfect. So it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you about Embrace and especially how you all are thinking about mobile SLOs. Again, I am Kate Holterhoff, Senior Analyst at RedMonk. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and review all of RedMonk's video offerings on your podcast platform of choice. If you are watching us on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and engage with us in the comments.